Welcome to the Forefront 5. I'm Dr. Betsy Warnley, your host, and my guest today is Luke Nurnberger, who is the manager at the Kohler Experiential Learning Center in one of our favorite places, Kohler, Wisconsin. Luke is certified in insights discovery and several tools that he'll talk about that are about finding your strengths and building self-awareness, or as we talk about a lot with Giacomo Maggiolino at Forefront, your EQ, your emotional intelligence. We hear Giacomo talk a lot about identifying emotional intelligence and building it to become a better leader in your clinic, for your coworkers, and your patients as well. So Luke, before we discuss your assessment programs, why don't you give us a little bit of background on how the Kohler Experiential Learning Center started, the programs you offer, and kind of what you do on a daily basis.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Betsy. It's cool to be here. And high level of the Kohler Experiential Learning Center. So it started back in 95, so 26 years ago now. Unfortunately, our 25th anniversary was on a pretty tough year for team building, but been around a while. It started with the Kohler family actually having an interest in an organization called Outward Bound, which is pretty much like outdoor adventure education. Started with as like survival training for sailors. So they'll get you outside, they do hands-on learning and basically learning by doing. And so that's like the thread within Kohler. The Kohler family has all done that and loves it. And so some members of the Kohler family actually started this within Kohler Company, 26 years ago now. So it's evolved quite a bit. It started as this almost like team building outlet for resorts of the Destination Kohler Resort. So it was really like this local sort of service thing that just catered to those guests of the place. And now it's evolved, 26 years later into this full-scale team building and leadership development operation where I've been around the U.S. and we have, Kohler's a global company. So I know most people know us for our toilets and engines and, the resort and things like that. But I work with people all over the world virtually doing, team building, leadership development, fun stuff, creative stuff, developmental stuff. I mean, just a whole range of things. So basically, I just tell people when they ask me what I do, I say I work with a group of people wherever they're at, and I try to get them to the next level. If that's through fun or, through more developmental assessments, things like that. So high level of the specifics of what we do. I mean, I've done anything fun from like, boat building competitions and races to like, we have a challenge course with a zip line and rock climbing wall. We have all these personality assessments that really just help teams understand themselves and those around them better. Sometimes we combine everything, cooking competitions. I mean, you name it. We pretty much do it for the most part. A lot of virtual activities now too. So it's quite a range. What I do on a daily basis, I run the business. So basically we're like this tiny business within this huge corporation. And so it's kind of fun because I get to almost like a team consulting company within this large corporate umbrella, help Kohler teams and also people that are outside of that as well. So every day is different. I get my hands dirty sometimes. I also have to sit back and work on the business a little bit, but it's pretty diverse. So
that's cool. So are you like Bear Grylls, or I can't remember how to say
Bear Grylls? Yeah.
Yeah. We could like put you out in the middle of nowhere and you could survive for a few days.
Yeah. So I guess so. Depends on where. I'm more familiar with like the Midwest and things like that. Certain environments I wouldn't do so hot in, but the interesting thing is a lot of corporate clients are not as into that. So especially when they're coming to a 5-diamond resort. So we try to keep things a little more what I'd call inclusive for the majority of like, professional adult clients. In my past life, I did wilderness survival courses and, hiking and fishing and all that stuff when I worked, before I came to Kohler. So
that's cool. My husband's super into that. And just a little Forefront connection. We always have a retreat at Kohler, and it's a business meeting, and we incorporate all the fun of Kohler as well. Back in the early days, my very first retreat, there was like 15 of us. It was a very small group. And I remember for our activity, we got on a bus and we went and we did this. And I think it was a very small version of what you do now, but we did kind of like the ropes course and some of the team building exercises. So we do have a connection with Forefront. Let's talk a little bit about emotional intelligence. Sometimes people are like not into this, you know, especially doctors. I don't need to talk about my emotional intelligence. I don't need to introspect, but maybe the people that respond that way are the ones that need it the most. So to talk to our listeners about what emotional intelligence is, what it means to you, why it's important.
Yeah, well, that's an awesome question. I love to talk about it. I think what's interesting is actually a majority of the work that I've done really didn't involve a lot of active emotional intelligence until just the past few years when I've been working at Kohler now, I guess 3 years. And that's just because it plays such a huge role in, I think, professional and personal development. So with that said, the whole concept of emotional intelligence came from Daniel Goleman and a book that he wrote that's called Emotional Intelligence years back. And so the whole premise of it is IQ, which is, you know, this measure of intelligence or this almost this knowledge and your ability to solve puzzles and all those things was only, you know, we would call people smart or capable by that. And found out that really some of the people that had the highest IQs were for some reason not very successful when it came to interpersonal work or, you know, any place that you have to interact with other people. And so that's where this whole idea of emotional intelligence came out of this. You know, it's the acronym for it or abbreviation is EQ. So it's like there's IQ, which is this mental intelligence, knowledge, head knowledge, and then there's this EQ of emotional intelligence, which summarized is basically your ability to be self-aware and then interpersonally aware, and then not only awareness, because I think that's head knowledge, but actually what can you do with that? How can you manage that? Okay. So ask yourself, I mean, do you work with other people at any point in order to get things done? Whether like you have tasks, you know, you have to operate on somebody or like, of course, that knowledge is important. But at some point, my guess is that you're going to have to interact with a client. You know, you'll have to interact with your team or even like your own family members, you know, people like that. At some point, you'll have that. And so it's basically like relationship management is like summarized in that way. And so you ask yourself, do you have to interact with people well? And if you do, then emotional intelligence should matter to you. And you, of course, everybody has it. It's just a varying spectrum, right, of that level of awareness and your intentionality and how much you want to really be aware of that and manage that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In that book, it sounds super interesting. Does he give, you know, a way to yourself? I know online, you know, you can take IQ tests to see how smart you are. Can you take EQ tests?
Yes, you can. So with his books, there's emotional intelligence, which that's very much of like the philosophy, the introduction to the concept, really groundbreaking book. And then from there, there's what's called Emotional Intelligence 2.0, which is based on his work. And that's more of like a face value, application, actions. You know, here's 10 tips, you know, sort of like blogs, sort of content you would find or find on Google, right? Of like, what's 10 things you can do to increase your emotional intelligence. There's an assessment involved, which I think that's good. We've used those resources for some situations, but we use a lot of other resources as well out there, like, you know, Myers-Briggs and Insights Discovery and these other ones too. So,
and I think, you know, one thing I've learned about doctors in particular, we love to know our personality assessments. Like it's kind of fun to figure out Myers-Briggs and others. But then it's like, what do you do with it, right? What do you do with your assessment on your emotional intelligence or your personality? How do you apply that to working with clinic or working with difficult patients, et cetera? So I think these are all really cool topics, but then maybe later in the podcast, we'll talk about how you apply them as a physician. And one other question before we move on, have they tracked, we talked about IQ, and some people are really, really smart, have a really high IQ and a terrible EQ. Have they tracked, you know, high IQ personalities in general have a lower EQ?
I don't know if there's a direct correlation there. What I will say is that book on emotional intelligence has a ton of research and like data that I think is presented in a really approachable way. I mean, for someone like me who's not like a bookworm or like looking at spreadsheets all day, so less of like a, I don't know, like a medical journal style, where it's
Yeah.
very like, it's just like layman's terms, I guess you could say, right, where anybody could approach it, but lots of data and research that basically goes to show people that, measuring emotional intelligence and then measuring their success, which, is based on like their jobs they get and, income levels and things like that, that there are correlations there, which is part of the case that Daniel builds in his book. So it's a good read.
Very cool. Any other good reads for us other than the Daniel Goleman's?
I think speaking on emotional intelligence, that's probably the number one that I have in my mind. Yeah.
Cool. And what's what would be your biggest key? I think you told me in our conversations that striking the balance is key. Can you talk about that, Luke?
Yeah, I think striking the balance, like what exactly do you mean with that? Like between the two different IQ and EQ, is that what you're talking about?
In managing your emotions is kind of a tool to maybe function the best in a clinic atmosphere as a physician or with staff, when you should be emotional, when you should not be emotional. You talk about that to clients and striking the balance on that.
Yeah. So in Daniel Goleman's book, and I mean, you can kind of look this up too, just about anywhere, but there's this theory about the brain, which is like simply, I mean, you can get really detailed, right? Hopefully there's no brain surgeons listening to this because they'll probably judge me, right? Not a brain expert, but what I will say is that what we do know is our brain processes through like a different order. And so you could almost divide that, like this is very simple, but like almost this primitive or like initial sort of processing and then this executive level of your brain. And there's different parts that kind of put that together, right? And so primitive would be like things like emotional responses, impulsiveness, immediate decisions, desires, wants, all those things, kind of that piece. And then this executive level of thinking, which is more of, strategy, really processing, analysis, thoughtfulness, taking your time, patience, right? And the whole idea with EQ is that you need to be able to manage your emotions so that we can spend more time thinking at a higher level of thinking. And so great example would be, there's times like when you talk about striking the balance that like you need to be emotional, right? You need to feel, maybe you're grieving, maybe, something happened. Emotions are good, right? But it's that emotional management that's key. So it's like, let's say there's a crisis, right? Hopefully, the people like in maybe a car accident or like a surgery room or something, the people that are getting emotional are not the ones that have to take action in that moment and address the crisis or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? So that's part of that. I need to manage my emotions, right, and process that. I need to think at this higher level of thinking, this, executive brain function. But also, there are these moments where that's okay to feel, that's okay to react, and that's okay to kind of work through that. And so another piece of emotional intelligence is basically saying, I need to be more mindful of the times that I should be emotional or connect or have that level of empathy. And then these other kinds of times that I should be more mindful of, like, okay, those basic needs are met, and so I'm going to be more likely, to be able to think properly and strategize, set aside time, which Emotional Intelligence 2.0, second book that I mentioned, spends a lot more time on that, right? So, another example would be I stay up late, I'm kind of super stressed out. So I'm probably more likely to be emotional, reactive, short temper, but if I'm able to take care of myself a little bit, then I probably have more time to plan, think, get a good night's rest, and I'll probably be able to think with a little bit of a better version of myself. So is that helpful?
Yes, I love that. And, from January to June at Forefront, we really focused on what we called a leadership series because, it's super important right now. It's one of the toughest employment markets in America. So being a leader and a positive leader in your clinics or in your department, no matter where you work, is key because, we've talked about many books, but one being, speaking the languages of appreciation to your coworkers or to your employees under you. That's vital. And I think one of the issues with doctors, and maybe you can comment on this too, but we went through medical school and we were taught to desensitize because, you're with a bleeding patient or you're in the OR or you have to deliver terminal diagnoses and be the strong one for the patient. So you almost remove yourself. And then you have to choose times throughout the day to insert empathy or to turn that side of your brain on to connect with patients, or you've just turned it off in a surgical emergency, but then you have to be emotional with your staff. And it's this constant back and forth between those two realms that I think make it very hard for some physicians, or frankly, all of us, to strike the balance to be that leader and to kind of be everything for everyone and use both sides of our brains constantly. Does that make sense?
Totally does. And that's exactly what I'm saying, right? Because you're saying there's a crisis situation. You have to shut those emotions off and think strategically. You have to make the right calls. But then you have to shift, and you have these staff that were in that experience with you. How do we process? How do we work through that? We're not just robots. So, right, we feel, we see, we experience the sorts of things that we go through impact us. And so how do we work through that in a really good way without just suppressing that? I think that that's really what I would call striking that balance, and is really key.
That's cool. So I'm glad there's people like Daniel that write books, like people like Luke that can help us navigate this. So let's kind of shift and talk about what you do. From what I understand, you offer 3 different types of courses that kind of fall into an assessment category. The first is called Insights Discovery. Can you explain, Luke, the goal of this course, who it's recommended for, and what kind of exercises are covered and the outcome?
Yeah. Well, first off, I'll just say Insights Discovery is my favorite by far. We do it the most. It's awesome. We could offer any of these tools, but we've really honed in on a couple just because, we feel like they just do the best job and get things done, right? So Insights Discovery, at a high level, the goals here is just to understand personal and interpersonal communication preferences. So again, we're talking about, that EQ management. So, you'll hear EQ themes within what I'm talking about. Then from there, how do we connect better with colleagues, those around us, personal, family, team members, all those things. And then from there, some teams even can benefit from like a common language. So what I mean by that is, just to describe it well, you were talking about turning off, that emotional or that reactive part when you're in a surgery, right? And then other times you have to like be emotional. And so I think what we're all kind of dancing around here is this reality that when I talk with people, I say there's you as a person, and then there's your behaviors, and those are different. Okay, so the example that I love to use when I'm talking with groups and leaders is, I have 3 kids. My oldest son, 5 years old, love him with all my heart, but I hate his disobedience. Okay, so those are 2 different things. I love my son. I love the times that he obeys, but like that's different, right? I hate his disobedience. If I start to cloud those 2 things together, that's where things can get really dicey, right? Because then me as a parent, I'm starting to see my son as his actions, and which then makes my affection and my perception of him and even my value dependent on his actions, which I hope is not the case for someone whom I love, right? And so when you talk about that, and then you say, oh, okay, clearly like my team is not my son, right? But I still have to work with these people almost to like a family level. We have to work together. We have to function together. We have to rely on one another, trust one another. And so how can we value one another as individuals, but also navigate behaviors pretty much like a tool? And so when we talk about behaviors, right, it's like almost this big ocean. Like if I ask you, what behaviors do you like? What behaviors really frustrate you or, stress you out? I'm sure you have those preferences, right? And I could probably say the same thing. But let's start to break that down a little bit and really look at behaviors as like this holistic. So less of just this things that I like and don't like, but more about, okay, let's add some language. Let's add some color to this and start to really do this in a way that we can understand ourselves, and then we can understand each other really well. Take it that 3rd step further. Now in the moment, let's be able to communicate with the, terminology that we've used, put around behaviors so that we understand like what each person is saying, what we need to do, what we're feeling, and to be able to navigate through like an EQ situation even better. So insights, what it does is it takes a lot of psychological terms, which, we might discuss in a little bit, and builds them into a model that shows four colors. And so these four colors basically, all this psychology, all this terminology underpins these four colors. And then from there, with these four colors, every person has a preference order. So it's not that you are the colors. The metaphor that I like to use is tools. So I say every person has all four colors in their tool pouch every day, but it's your preference order that makes you unique. And so let's say, someone comes up here and there's a nail that needs to get hit into a board. The red hammer with that sort of behavioral approach is probably the best tool for that job, right? And then let's say, there's a board that needs to get cut. The green saw, right, is probably the best tool for that job. Some people will swing the hammer and they love it, and they hit the nail. Other people might hit their thumb, right? It might be a little bit clumsy, but everybody, regardless, can pick up a hammer and try to swing it. You know what I'm saying? And so some people will walk up to a board that needs to get cut, and they're going to try to swing a hammer at it. And that's just how they do things, right? That's how they operate. And so, is that really the best approach? Does it work? Maybe it will, but it'll probably look different than if you picked up a green saw and approached it in that way. So basically, we try to slice that people, behaviors. Let's break this down into four colors, and then as a team, let's examine our own behaviors and those around us, and ultimately get to this end of what can we do to communicate better with each other, right? And so through insights discovery, they get this whole profile. It's 20 pages or so. It's just chocked full of these statements that they can use in an actual conversation, where I can look at you, Betsy, let's say that we're on a team and we're trying to figure something out, and we need to just touch base real quick and say, hey, what are our needs, so we can really create a more ideal environment for each other. That's where we start to say, when communicating with me, could you please try to keep these things in mind? Could you please avoid these things, right? Long-winded explanations, right? Or very brief, right? Or give me time to think, all those things like that. So that's really what insights discovery does. It's a ton of fun, honestly.
That's cool. On average, I assume most of these are business, corporate clients, right? And how big are the groups that you do this with?
Average, I would say, is anywhere from 6 to 15 people.
Very cool.
Sometimes it's bigger than that, which usually in that case, we're talking a lot of teams that are all part of the same unit. Other times I'll work with cohorts, which, let's say, it's a lot of different leaders coming together for a development experience. And so you can get 20, 30 plus, doing something like that.
That's awesome. Let's talk about the second offering, the Gallup Clifton Strengthfinders for teams. That's a mouthful. Tell us about this one, Luke.
Yeah, well, I love talking about this one too, and it's different, right? So Strengthfinder is pretty well known, actually. Most people, or at least if you ask a room full of people, have you heard of Strengthfinder before? Usually half the people have. It's pretty well known and accessible, similar to Myers-Briggs. But what it does that's different is it really talks about talents. So it's a talent measurement. Gallup is, a term that, again, even I'd say doctors and other people were probably pretty familiar with. They do a lot of surveys, a lot of reporting, a lot of data in any sort of range of, global topics. And they really own Strengthfinder. And so what's cool about that is they said, I think it was back in the 70s or 80s, this guy, Don Clifton, who was a business psychologist, basically the whole approach to managing people and kind of working through, development was going in and just fixing what was broken, focusing on the issues. You walk into a room, what's broken, what needs to be fixed, what's wrong with this team, what's wrong with this person, which honestly was a bit exhausting. And so he said, why don't we stop focusing on what's broken with people and start looking at what's really good with them? What are they doing well? What's motivating them, and how can we spend more time into that space? And so that's where this all came from. So Gallup basically took, and did a ton of studying on, thousands of people, and narrowed down 34 strengths or talents that they say that everybody has in a ranging order. And so the whole assessment is to measure talents and then say, all right, some of these things probably we're more aware of. like maybe there's 3 or 4 on that list that I'd say, yeah, I know that that's something that, is not a surprise to me. There may be some things on there that are not something that are very conscious of. And so, when we're talking about interpersonal relationships, the way you go about things, the time you spend, if you're in a mixed team, maybe like the projects that you assign, how can we really spend some more time in the areas and focus on the things that we do well? There's a lot of research they present that it's more motivating, more engaging for employees. They enjoy going to work more, when they spend time more in their strengths. And so that's the whole concept, right? Is what are my strengths, and then how can I spend more time on that? And the assessment is really in the whole team experience is saying, let's as a team identify this, rally around it, and just have some really good conversations and activities, that just help us realize this and, create a plan for when we walk out of here. How can we better recognize this and just have this environment, almost this like strengths-based, culture?
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a little less EQ versus, like you said, just what you're really good at. So it's more like the personality test that we're used to taking versus what you've talked about before. So let's talk about the final assessment, emotional intelligence for teams. I can see huge benefits for use of this just based on what you've taught us on the podcast about emotional intelligence in a clinical setting or an office setting. Tell us about the Emotional Intelligence for Teams program.
Okay. So our offering of emotional intelligence, which this is not like an out of the package deal. This is something that, Kohler Experiential Learning Center has created over the years, is really what I'd say is just more of like a beefed up insights discovery. So when we do an emotional intelligence assessment, we use the Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book or, curriculum, which you can find on Amazon if you want. And that comes with an emotional intelligence like code as long as you get a new book. You can take this online assessment that measures your emotional intelligence, gives you feedback, and then we use some topics from that book to talk about in order to help people kind of get more in touch and get take care of themselves, like I talked about with the brain functions, right? Get a higher level of emotional intelligence in their life. What are some really practical things that I can do in order to be a better version of myself and just be more aware in this area of emotional intelligence? Okay. So with that, though, often what I try to encourage people to do is couple that with our insights discovery assessment. The reason for that is because the emotional intelligence team experience, I would say, focuses on the emotional intelligence assessment and then the book content, which is really individually focused as far as what can I do. It doesn't spend as much time on that interpersonal connection with helping us find words to communicate our actual needs or pick up on our behaviors and communicate through that, I would say, behavioral piece. And so that's where, if we do emotional intelligence, we talk about the brain, we do the emotional intelligence measurement, all that stuff. And then the insights discovery is great because then it helps us get really specific with behaviors and what we can actually do to better connect.
Awesome. Yeah, that's what I was thinking is if you were going to choose one course to do at first, it would probably be the insights. And I think you said that that's not only your favorite, but you've told me that's the most popular among your clients. Is that right?
It is. And I think, the clients that I've worked with, sometimes, they're just management level and they're kind of like ground level. Other times, a lot recently, I've worked with a lot of company executives, C-suite level. These people, a dime a dozen for these sort of assessment experiences. And some of them have been through 5, 10, 20 plus of these sorts of things over the decades that they've been around. And insights discovery, by far, they can't get enough of it. It's just when we talk about emotional intelligence, we've gone into a little more depth, on this podcast, right, than I probably would with a group. But at the end of the day, people aren't wanting to be emotional intelligence, knowledge experts. They just need to connect better with their team and just make those connections and get work done and do it effectively. And so that's where I think insights discovery just hits that right on the head, which is really, really popular.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Do you have any way to measure the effectiveness, maybe post insights in their everyday setting once they've taken the course and get feedback on their everyday life and work life?
I've kind of personally just had tons of feedback from people reaching out to me. We do like a post-course assessment, and we always get good feedback from that. But honestly, for me, a measurement of the success of it is just the popularity and how it spreads. We don't do any advertising for it. What ends up happening is someone, usually like an executive level or even like lower level management, will go through it and they can't get enough of it. They want all their team members to go through it. They want, or, if it's coming from the bottom up, then they're talking about it and they're saying, hey, manager, we need to get this done. This is super important. And it spreads like word of mouth. It's just wild. So that actually really picked up, I think, in the past 6 to 9 months within Kohler Company. And it's just exploding right now, even globally. So to me, that sounds like success.
Yeah, for sure. And of note, I know that you offer virtual, you offer in person, and then maybe a team's already taken it and you have a new hire. You do a one-on-one for new hires to an existing team as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, insights discovery sets itself up for a team context, but it can be used in personal coaching, one-on-one leadership development. I mean, a lot of different things. So, often what we'll do is we'll go in with a team, we'll work with them. And then, of course, there's usually personnel changes at some way along the road. And so, sometimes we'll do a 6-month follow-up, we'll do a 12-month follow-up, if the group wants it, or we'll do like a refresher. There's 1 to 2 people that join the team. I'll meet with them and, help coach them through and get them up to speed. The other fun thing is, with all these sorts of experiences, this whole experiential approach that we do with the ropes course and, all these team challenges and things like that, if the team wants it, we'll even couple that with an insights discovery assessment just to deepen the learning and the conversation. And, it can be a ton of fun. It doesn't just have to be like, we're hardly ever sitting in a room staring at PowerPoint. So
Yeah.
Super engaging.
We do enough of that. That's awesome. So summarize how you see each type of course offered benefiting our listeners. We've got dermatologists, we have nurses, we have medical assistants, we have people working in our call center, billing center, we have a C-suite. We have a lot of different people. So talk a little bit about how this could impact people at Forefront Dermatology.
Yeah. Well, the way that I could really summarize that is imagine an organization where everybody could meet each other where they're at. So, depending on your day, depending on if you need to talk about the weather, first, or just get to know your colleagues a little bit and build some rapport and build some trust, or, if you're need to get things done, right? It's very urgent. And so can't talk about that. We just need to get it done, right? What if we could have that environment at work where people are able to pick up on and recognize each other, and where we're at and just meeting each other almost like a culture, right? So imagine culturally, right? If I go to another country, hopefully when I show up there, I'm kind of adapting in ways that are going to build connections and build trust and, respect the way that they do things and the way that they operate and even their needs, not just my own, right? And so, imagine a whole company culture that does that with behaviors, insights discovery, EQ, any of that stuff, that's going to get it done, right? Now, imagine if I talk about Strengthfinder, right? Imagine a culture where when you're in a project or a team, you're able to communicate in a language that makes sense, the things that you really enjoy doing and the stuff that actually motivates you. What if we could all recognize that and rally around that and create more of a culture where we really do that for one another, look out for one another, collaborate, right? So maybe I'm having this issue over here with maybe detail orientation or, strategy. And I realize there's someone on my own team or in my own department that is just a rock star at that, right? Maybe I can reach out to them and get some perspective, right? Rather than just kind of guessing or going off of water cooler conversations, right? So that'd be Strengthfinder. So I think that's really how these offerings could help if you're, interested.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. We talked a little bit about Myers-Briggs testing, and I think there's 5 main personality traits: mind, energy, nature, tactics, and identity. All of these qualities, people like you say, influence your habits at home, at work, their strengths and weaknesses. Do you use those in your work?
Yeah, I do. So when I spoke on insights discovery earlier, what I wasn't getting into the weeds with, which I can speak at a high level now, is basically those different personality types, your you're talking about that underpin a model like insights discovery. So where a lot of this stems from is the psychologist Carl Jung and his work on personality preferences. So the main three pairs actually are introversion and extroversion, which is kind of where you, okay, I'm going to really simply summarize these sorts of things, right?
Yeah, please do.
Right. So, where you get energy from and maybe what drains you. So is it more of this external, like, do you like change? Do you like, differences, kind of a switch up of routine, things outside of your norm? External, that's more of that extroverted, if that fills your cup up, right? At the end of your day when you're tired or, you need to kind of recharge, right? Introversion would be more of the like internal experiences. So maybe consistency, pattern, familiar relationships, going by yourself and just reading a book, more of that, like things that you can anticipate or expect, right? That's more of what might recharge your battery or like fill your cup up, right? And then there's thinking and feeling, which I see in teams really can create some divides. So thinking is more of this task focus and this, driving towards results and data metrics and all that. And then feeling is more of this emotion or this like relationship focus is kind of a simple way to summarize it. Sensing and intuition is more of like, let's say if I hold up a cup of water and I say, how full do you think it is? Like intuition might say, well, it's half full. And I say, why? And you're like, I'm not sure. I just feel that way. Or, that's the way that I've always said it. Sensing would be more of, well, what's the curvature of the cup? What's the liquid inside of it? What does it smell like? Was it being filled up or drank from, right? So that's kind of like a simple way of describing those preferences. And those personality types are what underpin models like insights discovery. Myers-Briggs uses them quite literally. So they they're quite prescriptive in their, introverted versus extroverted, sensing versus feeling. And then I think they add a few others like judging and perceiving and things like that in there as well. Maybe just to get more specific in those areas, but that's really what you see. So, but all of it usually comes from Carl Jung's work, and it all goes to measure personality, which is part of this debatable piece of like, does it change? Does it not? How do you respond to that? But at the end of the day, what we see and experience is those behaviors, which can come from all these different kind of personality traits we're starting to talk about.
Yeah, that was a really great explanation. And, I took a personality test and it said I was an ENTJA. And it said I was a commander, which my husband would probably agree with. And we're probably opposites and we work really well together. But I always struggle with those tests because it's like, okay, so what do I do with that? So that's why I love your approach, because you would do something with that or tell me what I should do with that. And that's what your courses do. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I would say, assessments like that, Myers-Briggs, they all do that as well. But I almost feel like they spend more time on the psychological analysis piece of it, the graphs, the terminology, which at the end of the day, unless you're super into it, which there's people out there that, average person that's just a, super Myers-Briggs fanatic or, those different like psychological terms, they know what all that means because they're enthusiastic about it. And so, they're going to remember that stuff and it's going to make sense to them. But then, it usually only goes that far.
Yeah.
Unless you meet and sit down with someone, right? And so what we're really trying to look at is those behaviors. So spending less time on what does introversion and extroversion mean and more time on what are the behaviors that we're experiencing so that we can actually get, to a common place.
Yeah, you do a really good job of making it make sense. So talk about how instead of saying, ENTJ, whatever, you say we have 4 colors and here are the different characteristics of the colors. Talk about your colors.
Well, so with the colors, I would say first off, someone has to be told what the colors are as well in order to get that, right? So hopefully, in this context, there's a team where we're all together and I do spend some time educating them on what those colors mean, but it's pretty straightforward. It's intuitive, right? So like, out of the 4 colors, red is more of this action oriented, quick decisions, purposeful, focused, competitive, that whole piece of it, right? Which as far as psychological types is more of this extroverted thinking. And then yellow is going to be more of this like sociable, dynamic, optimistic, creative, persuasive, kind of like extroverted and feeling, which is more like people focused and like emotion focused, but still that extroverted energy, right? So green's going to be more of this democratic, reliable, patient, encouraging, relaxed, caring, people focused, right? So that's more of that introverted and feeling preference. And then the blue is more of this detailed, formal, objective, deliberate, analysis, all those things, which is more of that, I would say, thinking and then introverted, right? So those are the four colors, right? And when you do insights, which I almost sound like I'm an insights employee. I'm not. I'm just a super fan, right? But if you know what those colors are, then you can communicate in that language, and it's great. If you don't know what those colors are, the nice thing is, when you get into that profile, all those statements in there, you can ask anybody those questions. You can use those statements on anybody. In the profile, they don't use colors to talk about, because Luke is, leads with blue, then, you need to keep this in mind, or like Luke is blue. And so, like there's none of that in the profile. It just all goes to like really ground level things, which I think is something that anybody reading that profile, regardless of what you know about these colors, understands what to do or like what that means.
Yeah, and I think there's like purple, right? Once you understand it, you're like, oh, I'm a purple, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a red, I'm not a blue, I'm kind of both. I think this stuff's fascinating. So tell, with each of those colors, tell what that person, once you find out, oh, I'm a red, what I should do to deal with people.
Yeah, well, let me
deal with them.
Yeah, so this goes back to my analogy on tools, right? So when I talk about this, I say this model, these colors, we're not talking about people. So even in this podcast, I've kind of made the mistake of saying like I'm red or I'm blue, right? I try to steer people away from that, because then what you're doing is you're kind of putting labels on people's foreheads and even putting them into corners, which, a little personal story here. My uncle, he's pretty much retirement age. He's, been in corporate America for decades. And I told him, about like this whole like, color thing that I was doing in personality assessment. He didn't want anything to do with it. And some executives have had visceral reactions when they find out what I'm going to do with the team, because they think that they're going to have a label on their forehead. They're going to be stuck in a corner and told, this is you, right? We're looking at behaviors, right? So to clarify that, I think, when we look at these colors, the whole idea is every person has all four colors, but it's your preference order that makes you unique. And what I think that does is, when you're in a situation where like, we can't just pay attention to each other's needs, but we have to just get something done. Like, what is the project or the situation need, right? Example, surgery. Maybe there's a crisis that comes out. We can't sit there and say, well, this is how I like to do it. Well, this is my preference. We just need to get it done, right? And so in that moment, we need to set aside our personal needs in that moment and say, what's the most important thing in this situation? And so that's where it makes it less about me being attacked. Like an example I use is, instead of saying, hey, will you stop asking so many questions and being so suspicious of me? It would be, hey, let's move from blue and let's shift into red, because we have 5 minutes left and we need to make a decision, right?
I like that.
So the language shifts there, right? Now with every single person, you have all four colors. So there's no red people, there's no blue people, there's just our preference order. And what I've actually seen in my time doing this, you'll get a school of people, maybe even some of your listeners, that say, I am introverted or I am extroverted. More research is going to support that, rather than being more prescriptive, which, tends to come from like Myers-Briggs, more of that E or I sort of thing. It's almost like two muscles. So I have an extroverted muscle and an introverted muscle. And over time, I would say, I tend to be more extroverted. But there's moments or seasons in my life, or even over a period of time, where I can start to flex that introverted muscle more. And I may build a capacity for both. I may shift to being more introverted and my extroverted muscle gets weaker, right? And so thinking about it less of like you as a person and more of like your behaviors and the personality that you have that can change over time.
I like that. That's really cool. I think it's kind of fun to talk about famous people and who your personality or your color tendencies fit with. So mine, when I did when I did my personality assessment, I had some crazy ones, Teddy Roosevelt, Margaret Thatcher. What are your examples of famous people who fit into these different personality types?
Yeah, that's always a fun question. In fact, in some of my presentations, if I have time for it, I actually do like here's a picture and like guess what you think their like leading colors are, right? So keeping that in mind, limited knowledge of who these people are and like what they do. But what I would say is we're just talking about a leading color, not like them as a person and like this is right, the stamp we're putting on their forehead. But, I use Mother Teresa as a great example of green, right? So this caring, patient, encouraging, people focused, supportive, all those sorts of things. Ellen DeGeneres, right? The talk show host that's just always kind of full of surprises and just kind of random things, fun, bubbly, right? It's kind of more of that yellow approach. I think I've, used this example for blue as Spock, which makes people laugh because normally the people that lead with a lot of blue are like, Luke, that's actually like a robot. He's not even a human. And I'm like, well, if you had someone that was just pure blue as you could get, and maybe not a lot of other colors in there, you'd probably get more of a Spock, right? Very data oriented and like matter of fact and not a lot of emotion in there. Very reserved, right? Almost cold, to an extent. And then red's kind of tough, right? I think that the example that I came up with, I just had to look up into this. So I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan, but Han Solo came to my mind, right?
For
so
sure.
very like impulsive, quick to act, get over it. Like, especially him and his relationship with Leia, when you see like, this like almost like headbutting that happens, and like I'm calling the shots, I'm grabbing the wheels sort of thing, but very action oriented, fast thinking, get things done. That's more of that maybe Han Solo character. So
that was fun. Those are great examples. Thanks. So back to your programs. Once someone identifies maybe their traits or their tendencies, how do you guide them to success?
I think that the first step is identifying or awareness, right? So I think that, when we talk about cultural situations, like let's say that I traveled to another country and I heard about this, like an example in South Korea, and someone was at dinner and they were like pointing chopsticks as they were talking at a meal. Someone pulled them aside and said, hey, that's actually like offensive. You probably shouldn't do that. Oh my gosh, I want to build rapport with these people and build trust, so I'm not going to do that, right? And so I think that that's the first piece, is saying, let's become aware, let's step back, let's examine these in our own life, talk about them in the world, and then from there we say, okay, now what can we do with that information? And that's key. I think a lot of people spend time on awareness and they don't get to action. And that's where, especially in a team context, if I just spend, 75% of the session on awareness, then, people are going to probably be pretty turned off because they're like, are we literally just like categorizing and that's it? What do I do with this, right? What can I do to help? And so that's really where I spend the majority of the time, is saying, okay, now that we have this awareness, what can we do with this information? I think what's key here is like priorities or like context. So in a relationship between me and you, let's say, okay, let's identify our preferences. And now let's say in a conversation, we want to work better together. What are the things that are relevant for us? What are some areas that we need to spend some attention on? And let's look in our profiles or look at our results and say, what's some things that we can use as a platform to support a healthy conversation around that, so we can really drive towards some common ground. So, I mean, that's going to be, introspection. That's going to be maybe a few meetings or so, or like a team session. I mean, there's a whole different kind of range of ways that we can get this done.
I think that's cool. And I think an important thing is we do a lot of, what am I like? What are my tendencies? What do I like? What do I not like? But the key is to know the people that you're dealing with, their tendencies as well, and what they like and don't like. I think I can see that a lot working with my clinic nurses, getting into their shoes and not just guests, having discussions. So I love that you're doing that with teams. Talk about, are there different personality traits that do better in different fields or in different jobs? I'm sure you deal with all sorts of different careers.
Yeah, I do. And it's such an interesting question. I get asked that every once in a while. I would say that often it's in the context of like, there's a team and we're sitting around this like, model of all these colors. and there's a big gap in it, and they look at the gap and they're immediately like, what do we do to fill this gap? Or, we have a vacancy, and so we want to hire someone and make sure that they're the right fit. There are tools that do that, but I'd say personality is usually not, or like especially personality and behaviors is not a very successful way to measure that. My belief with that stems from, if you talk to people with Myers-Briggs, or you talk to like Insights Discovery, these other personality assessments, they say we're not a tool that should be used for hiring. And the belief with that is, that with enough motivation, you can shift and adapt your behaviors to get things done. And so, sales, for example, I did a sales group, and, depending on certain cultures you're from, you might think sales leads, and most people are going to lead from this kind of certain area. I've done sales group where there's people all around the model, all different places, very diverse. And so all of them sell, but they get it done in very, very different ways. And so I think that, what happens is the danger we fall into if we start making assumptions about people's behaviors, which again stems from our personality. If we start looking at people's behaviors and how they do things and, the way they manage their day and they're like detailed and all that stuff, and we start making judgment calls on like what jobs they're good or not good at, I think we might be missing some opportunity in what I call diversity of thought, which is, when we talk about diversity, I play in the diversity of thought space, right? And so I want to recognize diversity. I want to celebrate it. And I would say if we start calling shots on like this personality type is best for this job, these personality traits are best for this job, there'd probably be a lot of bias involved, and I'd be missing some opportunities.
That's a great answer. I love that. And that leads me to my next question. Once you have your personality or your color or your tendencies, can you really like just do a 180 and change your personality type, or is it pretty set?
So this is a pretty like almost like an age-old question or like a debatable thing. I'd say most people, so we go to the root of it is it genetic, or like is it something that's based on your environment? So that nature versus nurture argument, right? Personally, for me, I'd say, I'm sure there's an element of it that is genetic, or the way that maybe you initially start out, but I'm a huge believer in more of the nurture, the environment you're in, the way you're treated, what you find to be successful or not from a small kid, right? All my kids, I have a 11-month-old, I have a 2.5-year-old, I have a 5-year-old. All of them, it's just cause and effects constantly. They do this, it doesn't work out, they do that, it works out, and then they adapt and they shift, right? Based on their responses and things. And I just think that nurture is a huge piece of that. And so, when it comes to this, especially with these assessments, I've personally witnessed like C-suite level executives that, lead with, let's say, these top two, let's say like, blue and red, which ends up being a high preference for like task focus, right? And then 5 years later, they take the assessment again and their colors have completely flipped. And they're like high green and yellow, which are opposite colors from blue and red, and, more focused on feeling and emotion and listening to people in relationship, right? And I wouldn't say that happens all the time. That's pretty drastic, but it is possible. And so, what often happens is it's because of a major shift in our environment. That can be a traumatic experience, like a loss of a loved one, or it can be, divorce. It can be a major job change, major team culture shift, changes in responsibility can eventually change our behaviors, which I think roots down into maybe our personality preferences a bit. So maybe personality is a little bit more like who you are, like kind of the way you're wired is what I've heard. Maybe doesn't change as much, but over time with traumatic things or major things, it can change a bit, and potentially drastically at times. So I've experienced that in my own life, just major shifts in personality and all of that. And I've experienced it in other people as well. So long answer to your question, I think it can change, but it just depends. For most people, you won't see major shifts unless there's a major shift in your environment.
That's a good answer. So I'm sure we have, intrigued so many listeners. They're curious of their color or their personality type. I definitely want to get a bunch of forefront people down because your assessments and your classes sound amazing. But for those who might not have the ability and they want some assessments or some tests, I know you're not as huge of a fan as just going on and taking a personality test. What would you suggest for folks?
I think like, there's a ton of free, like, so before I got into insights discovery and all that, I would go on and do the free test with Myers-Briggs and, these kind of 16 type free personality tests and all that stuff. I think that's all great, right? Again, the key is, are you becoming more aware of yourself and then that in others? Okay. So I think that's key. I think any of that stuff works. But where I see there maybe being some issues is when people start to like take that on as an identity. I think that they can limit themselves a bit in their potential opportunities. And then if you're pumped up about it and you go to talk about it with other people, they may not be as excited as you about it, right? And so how do you carry that over? You can't always generate that. And so often what I feel like my advice to people, if they say, I'm not going to go through insights discovery, but I want to have some experience like this and learn and grow. So do one of those assessments, learn, and then ask yourself, not the terminology and the colors or the language that they use, but what's really the takeaway from this that I can action on, that I can remember in my day? What's, 1 to 3 or 4 things that I can just note down as things I could do differently, be more intentional, or share with someone that needs to hear it. And even a question that I can ask somebody else to get that same information from them, right? I think that that's going to be key, and you can go really far with that.
That's a great answer. This has been so amazing. I hope to meet you in person soon. I really appreciate you being a guest. We always close the Forefront 5 with 5 key takeaways. Like, what takeaways from any of this conversation would you like to leave us on the Forefront 5?
That's good. I think that the biggest takeaways are going to be when you look at EQ, right? So with the listeners here, what's maybe something with people around you, first off, with yourself, that you can be more self-aware with, right? So self-awareness is key. What are maybe, some relationships or someone that I want to connect better with? And then the second piece is, what can you do to make that happen? So is it like a question about communication style, or about, I need this, or what can I do to make a more ideal environment for you? I think that that's a huge thing that'll go really far.
That's a great one. And then the other 3 takeaways, that was 2, take one of your 3 classes at Kohler.
Yeah, that's right.
That's our final one. This has been another episode of the Forefront 5. Luke, we so appreciate your insights, and I hope it helps at least some people better understand their emotional intelligence and how to live better in our daily lives. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks a lot, Betsy. Have a great day.